German reflexive verbs describe actions that someone does to themselves. They're common in everyday speech and can be tricky at first, but once they're understood, they'll feel natural. In general, a reflexive verb is a verb that is used with a reflexive pronoun to indicate that the subject is acting on itself, so the subject and the object of the action are the same person. Reflexive verbs are often accompanied by a reflexive pronoun in the accusative, unless the verb already has a direct object, in which case the reflexive pronoun becomes dative. As a reminder, accusative and dative pronouns look like this, but when used with reflexive verbs, all pronouns become reflexive, and some even change form. Mich, dich, sich, uns, euch, sich. Mir, dir, sich, uns, euch, sich. As you can see, sich has multiple applications, while the rest of the pronouns stay in their basic form. However, do not confuse them with object pronouns, because all of these are reflexive, so they're simply borrowed. When expressing a reflexive verb in a main clause, the reflexive pronoun will go after the conjugated verb, but in special cases, it can move places, and it's something I'll explain later. Still, it's important to understand when to use reflexive verbs, so the best ways to use them will be in actions done to oneself, idiomatic expressions, and descriptions of emotional or mental states. One example is Ich wasche mich. I wash myself. This is an action done to me, so ich is the subject and mich refers back to the subject, myself. A similar example is Ich dusche mich. I shower myself, which has the same structure. These examples are accusative because they have no other direct object. As I mentioned previously, if there is another object, the form will be dative, like Ich kämme mir die Haare. I comb my hair. Die Haare is the direct object, so the reflexive pronoun switches to the dative, mir. Other examples are Ich zieh mich an. Rasiert sich. Ich freue mich auf das Wochenende. Ich ärgere mich. Du freust dich. All of these phrases are accusative, so they're not too difficult to understand. Aside from these verbs, we can look at common reflexive verbs, their infinitive forms, and some examples, so in case you need to use them in context, now you know how. Furthermore, I mentioned that a reflexive pronoun goes after the conjugated verb, and this is true in a main clause, like Ich zieh mich an. Freust du dich? However, in a subordinate clause, a reflexive pronoun will follow the subject and precede it, due to the verb shifting to the end as a rule. Ich weiß, dass du dich freust. I know that you are happy. Some reflexives are tied to specific prepositions, which are often expressed in the accusative, like sich freuen, working with auf, sich interessieren, with für, sich erinnern, with an, sich ärgern with über, and sich kümmern with Some examples are Ich freue mich auf den Urlaub. Ich interessiere mich für Kunst. Ich erinnere mich an die Reise. Ich ärgere mich über den Fehler. Kümmert sich die Kinder. This is how reflexive verbs with prepositions work, but it's also important to understand verbs that can be used reflexively and non-reflexively, which can change meaning. In this case, we have to look at what makes a regular verb different from a reflexive one. For instance, sich setzen means to sit down, which is an action done to oneself, while the regular verb sitzen means to set something. Similarly, sich treffen means to meet each other, while treffen means to meet someone. Sich waschen is to wash oneself, and waschen is to wash something. Sich fragen is to wonder, and fragen is to ask. At this point, some English definitions take the meaning of prepositional verbs, which is an effective way to remember them. Here, we have some examples of both reflexive and non-reflexive verbs, so you can see and understand the difference. Ich setze mich auf den Stuhl. Ich setze das Glas auf den Tisch. Wir treffen uns morgen. Ich treffe meine Freunde im Park. Wäscht sich die Hände. Wäscht das Auto. Ich frage mich, ob das stimmt. Ich frage, meinen Lehrer eine Frage. This is the difference between reflexive verbs and non-reflexive ones, yet more concepts need to be known. When using reflexive verbs with modal verbs, a reflexive pronoun still refers to the subject, but the reflexive verb moves to the end of the sentence in the infinitive form, like Ich muss mich beeilen. Du willst dich setzen. Kann sich entspannen. The reflexive pronoun stays after the conjugated modal verb, but the reflexive verb moves to the end. Moreover, some verbs are reflexive in German, but not in English. This can be tricky because you need to remember the reflexive pronoun, even though it can be unnecessary when translating to English. For instance, sich beeilen is to hurry, and it's a basic verb in English. So, it's tempting to say ich beeile, but it's incorrect without the reflexive pronoun. Therefore, we must add the pronoun. Ich beeile mich. German also has many fixed idiomatic expressions that use reflexive verbs, but they're not always directly translated into English, like sich Sorgen machen, meaning to worry. German has many words for the verb, but the only logical English translation is to worry, and the same applies to the rest of the verbs. Some examples are Ich gebe mir Mühe. I'm making an effort. Macht sich Sorgen dich. He's worried about you. Kannst du dir das vorstellen? Can you imagine that? The last phrase was a question, and speaking of questions, reflexive pronouns will follow the subject or verb depending on a question structure. Just like in statements, a reflexive pronoun follows the subject in yes or no questions and direct questions, like Waschst du dich jeden Morgen? Do you wash yourself every morning? Freust du dich auf die Reise? Are you looking forward to the trip? One final concept is an informal omission of reflexive pronouns. In German informal speech, some native speakers can drop a reflexive pronoun when the context is clear, but this is technically incorrect, like saying Ich dusche. Grammatically, it means I shower, but in a clear context, it can mean I shower myself or I take a shower. This is informal, yet acceptable in everyday speech. But still, it's better to say the reflexive form for clarity and formality. Ich dusche mich. Overall, this is how reflexive verbs fully work in German.